Sorry. Everyone, Excellencies, delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Following last week's International Migration Review Forum, I would like to welcome you to our event, Human Trafficking and the Ukrainian Border. I would like to thank you all for taking the time to be here today and listening to our excellent lineup of speakers. With that, I would love to thank our panelists for coming over here and sharing their insights, expertise, and passion for this subject. Before I introduce our ambassador who will welcome in this event, I would like to draw your attention away for a couple of minutes to a video showing our international aid agency, Maldives International, and our efforts on the ground. Thank you very much, Tom. I would now like to introduce His Excellency Dr. Paul Beresford-Hill, the Permanent Observer of the Sovereign Border of Malta, to formally kick off this event. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much indeed. Quite harrowing visions and pictures which we've seen so many times played out on our televisions and seen on videos and all over the world. Last month, I had the opportunity of a short visit to Warsaw. And I was there to discuss the refugee crisis with a number of media and civil society leaders, as well as with the Order of Malta's Polish Association. While I was there, I had the opportunity to meet with 3 young mothers and their children. They had recently left the outskirts of Kiev and had made their way to Lviv by train. They told me that the train was crowded, as we've seen in the photographs and on the news programs, crowded with other mothers, with lots of young children, older people, ill people, some of them, on their way to escape the horrors of war. At one point in their journey, these 3 women who were traveling together were approached by 2 young women who appeared to be wearing clothes similar to the uniforms of other aid agency helpers that they'd seen at the station. This duo engaged the 3 refugee women in conversation about their impending trip to Poland, and they offered them transportation from Lviv to the Polish border, and then presented them with the opportunity of finding them jobs in Switzerland, offering them along the way to provide accommodation for themselves and their children. When a security guard entered the carriage, these 2 human traffickers quickly disappeared, only to surface again when the passengers disembarked the train at the Lviv train station. But these 3 women were savvy. They picked up exactly what was going on. They figured out the reality of their situation. But when you are desperate, when you are alone, when you are emotionally exhausted and fatigued and frightened, your ability to determine what's too good to be true is often compromised. Judgment is clouded and fatal decisions can be made. I hope that this dialogue this afternoon, led by my special advisor for human trafficking, Deborah O'Hara-Rusckowski, a wonderful, wonderful advocate for freedom, for health, and for the liberation of people from this modern slavery. I hope that this event will enable us to understand more the situation at the Ukrainian border, to appreciate the dimensions of human trafficking that are now at play, and provide us with some insights, thanks to the wisdom and the guidance of a distinguished group of panelists, which we were able to bring here today, how best we can handle, how best we can mitigate the effects of this scourge.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your kind words. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's an absolute pleasure for me to moderate such a distinguished panel of guests, an outstanding panel, I might say. And you're all experts in respective fields. And I think we're in for a very good treat this afternoon on such a serious topic with these experts. Just to give you a brief overview of my background, I also have founded a organization called Global Strategic Operatives, and this was the result of a high-level meeting at the UN in November 2018. And it was one of those meetings that brought together many sectors: healthcare, business, law enforcement, legal, etc. And what we were trying to do is ascertain the best way and where to focus. Of course, in human trafficking, as you can imagine, it's just all over now. And if you try and do everything, you won't do anything well. So we brought together experts, and through that meeting, Global Strategic Operatives was born. Where was the decision to focus on the healthcare sector? And the reason for that is because of 88% in clinical studies and data, 88% of all survivors have sought out medical care while they're being trafficked. So we realized that the people on the front lines are the healthcare providers. Okay, so that started our journey, but as I know Coralanne, you'll appreciate evidence-based practice. We needed to do a study. We needed to make sure that what we were doing, the methodology and the content, was effective. And so we decided to embark on a UN human trafficking pilot research study. We had an IRB with UT Tyler. We got several systems, and I think healthcare systems, integrated delivery network systems, which is a big word for hospital, lots of other hospitals. And that was in the US. Our target goal was 6, half dozen, and then 6 internationally. Well, we got 5 done, and then you know what hit was COVID. So we had a little bit of a pause, pivoted, and went into virtual and a hybrid model. And we just finished up a few months ago with a couple of sites in Italy. We had done India, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Albania, and Italy. So along with 5 large integrated delivery network systems in the US. That right now, that data is all very positive. It's going to be published in medical peer review journals, but also one of the goals on top of teaching healthcare providers how to identify and what actions, appropriate actions to take, was the creation of a policy. People were giving us advice, concentrate on policy. So what we did was help these hospitals chains develop their own policies. Now, what we're going to do with that, we have experts that are synthesizing and normalizing cultural differences. But then this year, hopefully at the General Assembly, we will approach and ask the World Health Organization to consider implementation of, when we whittle it down to one universal policy that can be implemented worldwide. Healthcare, human trafficking policy by healthcare providers, which currently does not exist. So that is our big goal, and that is what we are accomplishing this year. And those are pretty exciting, exciting things that we're looking forward to. Let me refocus back to the topic at hand. Russia invades Ukraine, catastrophic humanitarian and human trafficking crisis, which Bishop, you and I were saying, is not really well on the media radar. Okay, we hear it here and there, we really don't hear a lot of it. So, and this will impact the world worldwide. We say we're shoveling against the tide. I think we have a tsunami that we are going to have approaching across Europe and will reach our shores as well. So we're here today with this exceptional panel. We're going to discuss their efforts of their organizations that have been involved, perhaps what they've personally witnessed, and discuss what more can be offered to help derail this tsunami. And it'll be interesting to see how the legal, the business, and the healthcare and the religious sectors are going to intersect today on this panel. So we've asked each panelist to prepare a short statement, less than 5 minutes, and I'll introduce them briefly. We'll have your statement, we may have a follow-up question, and then we'll go through each of you, and then we will open it up to discussion, okay? So first, Bishop John Bonnici, welcome. And Bishop Bonnici is currently the pastor of 2 parishes in Larchmont, New York, and recently appointed by Pope Francis to be a new auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese. Congratulations again. And he was also with Cardinal Dolan recently on his delegation to a recent trip to the Ukraine. He'll share a statement from Cardinal Dolan, as well as his experiences they shared while on the trip together. Bishop Bonnici is also on the board of directors for the Aid to the Church in Need, USA, and will discuss the efforts being made from this wonderful organization. We look forward now to hearing from you, Bishop. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to start by sharing the statement of His Eminence Cardinal Dolan. Human trafficking is a heinous crime that enslaves mainly women and children, exploiting them and violates their God-given human dignity and rights. During my recent visit to the refugees and internally displaced persons in Poland, Slovakia, and Ukraine, all suffering due to this tragic and senseless war, I was inspired by the compassionate response of so many, particularly from agencies like the Catholic Near East Welfare Association, the Knights of Malta, the Knights of Columbus, Caritas, Aid to the Church in Need, as well as local dioceses and parishes, all working together to meet the physical, psychological, and spiritual needs of those whose lives have been terribly upended. To even imagine that there are others who would seek to entrap these individuals already so vulnerable and hurting, and mistreat them through the horror of human trafficking is difficult to comprehend. As Pope Francis has said, it is imperative to do all that we can, quote, to support, accompany, and reintegrate the victims, and to assist them in the process of healing and recovery of their self-esteem, unquote. Be assured of my gratitude for your efforts to highlight this often overlooked consequence of this conflict, and a remembrance in my prayers for the success of your work. Well, as was mentioned, I had the privilege of joining these veterans on that trip. And even though I've been on the board with Aid to the Church for over 15 years, being present in a war zone, watching refugees pour off of trains, making their way through a process to seek help was both sad and simultaneously encouraging. What encouraged me most was just watching the church at work, not just one aspect of the church, but the entire church. You know, the hierarchy, the religious, the laity, with one common mission, and that was to provide assistance, immediate assistance, for a very large number of people in sudden need. And the groups that were present, as mentioned in the Cardinal's statement, were not in conflict or tension. Neither was looking for an advantage or glory. It was all about coming together to meet the immediate need. And they are doing it incredibly well. And they are not being held in a box. They're thinking outside of the box, looking for alternative ways to continue to provide the assistance required, adapting to the situation on the ground, not projecting their own plans on the people's needs, but actually listening to the real needs expressed by the people themselves. And that was incredible. The other thing that caught my attention in the entire delegation was when we got to Poland initially, we expected to see, a large refugee camp, 10 cities, which you often see on television during these types of tragedies. There are none to be found anywhere. People are all being housed in homes, in schools, in convents, in monasteries, in churches, and they're being cared for by people truly expressing an act of love. So there are no tents. Over 4 million people are being housed in Poland in homes. They're predominantly in the large cities. And the reason for that is not that there's no room in rural areas, but they don't want to go there because they basically all want to go back home to the Ukraine. That's their goal. Hopefully they'll have homes to go back to. But they want to stay close. They're not interested in going too far away. Polish and Ukrainian languages are similar enough where communication is possible. Not perfect, but possible. And in Poland, prior to the war, we learned that many Ukrainians would migrate and work. A lot of them had work permits. So their familiarity with Polish culture and law made this transition a bit more comfortable. So when we were there, we were astounded. I mean, to imagine, as I mentioned to some privately, there are cloistered convents that are opening their doors with permission to house women and children. Fully habited nuns are cooking and cleaning and taking care of babies so that the children, its parents, their mothers, could go to work. Priests, are doubling up in rooms in rectories so they can provide space, a safe space for women and children. One bus driver, when we initially arrived, told us when the war started, and initially there was this huge number that they weren't really prepared for. He got worried, so he told his wife that he was going to go to the supermarket and stock up on food because there would be this surge of people trying to fill their own stores. And when he got there, his fears were realized. The lines were long, you know, and there was a huge commotion, and the shelves were getting empty quickly. But then something unusual happened. He realized they weren't buying the food for themselves. They were buying it for the refugees. And that to him was stunning. They were not thinking about their own needs, but the needs of those who they didn't know, total strangers coming over the border. When we did finally make our way into the Ukraine, into Lviv, you know, we again discovered these groups hard at work. To give you an example, the Knights of Malta in particular. One of the things that the Russian forces are doing that's horrible amidst everything else is they're poisoning the water supply. So they're throwing poison into wells deliberately and into rivers so that people have no drinking water. So water has become a huge need. So they're renting these tanker trucks with water, and they're having bottled water delivered. And the Knights themselves are paying for the trucks, which is not cheap. The supplies are donated and also paid for, but they themselves are driving the trucks into the war zone as close as possible because they know what's happening. They know what the needs are. So, you know, the amazing part of this story, despite the tragedy, is to see all these groups coming together, working together so hard with a common mission. And whether it's the Knights of Malta, Columbus, Caritas, Aid to the Church in Need, or Panelist, each one is doing what they can, and they're responding effectively. And it's in Poland, it's in Slovakia. We were able to go into the other areas, but in the Ukraine itself. And the people are incredibly appreciative. The question of human trafficking did come up, and we asked. And they did acknowledge that initially, when those first trains arrived, because if you recall, the number of refugees coming over the border was growing exponentially each day after the war started. They weren't totally prepared, right, to handle it, and that's understandable. But they quickly realized, they told us, that a process had to be put in place. Protocols had to be followed. And fortunately, a lot of these aid groups already had people trained in that area because they've done it before, sadly. So they knew what to look out for. They used the resources available and they trained their volunteers. Because initially people were coming from everywhere offering to help, but they quickly realized that not all of that help was legitimate. So after about a week, they said things settled, structure was put in place, and the issue of human trafficking, though still real, was mitigated to a healthy degree.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bishop. And, you know, what we were hearing too was how badly the border crisis was out of control with human trafficking. And of course, the help was needed 12 weeks ago. However, when we found out that the women were also, they had come from a communistic background, had experience in that, they were afraid to get on the buses. Because where would the government bus bring them? Where would they end up in Russia, back in Russia, and things like that? And so that these good Samaritans that showed up at the cars, they were actually enticed to get into them, thinking that they would bring them someplace. I know that we'll get to the solutions side of the discussion, but we heard from the training, it was imperative that these women and girls needed to know if they were going to get in those cars, what they needed to do to really protect themselves. So, and unfortunately, I know it was high in the beginning, but it continues now. It still continues. But just a quick question: Aid to the Church in Need, USA. Will you think about a different model of with your fundraising and things with human trafficking after what you've seen? Do you think about it, human trafficking, or something that would help that issue?
I think certainly the experience has given myself and my sharing of the story with the board, and also we've been sharing the story at a lot of venues since we got back, and people are greatly interested, both regarding potential, sadly, for trafficking, but also the need to respond and adequately deliver on the true need. And the only way we know that is by having people on the ground. You know, one of the greatest networks in the Ukraine in that area is the church, because they're already there. They know the people, they know their needs, and the people are very comfortable interacting with them. You know, none of the priests have left their congregations in the Ukraine. They're not maybe offering the celebration to the churches for fear of a bomb. They're in the subway tunnels offering mass and comfort. And so when these people are making their way across the border, they see familiar faces on the other side. And I think that is what is helping many of them make that.
Thanks so much. We'd like to introduce to you a friend and a colleague whom I met through our common passion in the fight against human trafficking, Laura Ellsworth. Laura is Jones Day's first partner in charge of global community service initiatives, spearheading the firm's rule of law initiatives around the world. She has served in many civic and leadership roles and has numerous awards and is recognized as a leader in her field of law. Some awards include Most Powerful and Influential Women, Lifetime Achievement Award, Legal Intelligence, and Lawyer of the Year by Best Lawyers in America, to name only a few, Laura. Laura and I have worked on a recent project together, which may be expanding, which we hope to hear more from about during our discussion. And Laura, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Deb, and thank you for organizing this. It's a very important topic, and I'm so glad to see it being reviewed at this level. So, as Deb said, I am with a law firm called Jones Day, one of the largest law firms in the world. We have 43 offices on 5 continents. And one aspect of my job is to lead the human trafficking work that we do across all of those offices before there ever was a crisis in Ukraine. And I think it's worth sort of just mentioning very briefly that human trafficking is a title that has a lot of different issues underneath it, and all of them are in play now in the Ukrainian situation. One of them that people think of is people smuggling people across borders. That is less prevalent in Ukraine because of the open border directives that are allowing people to cross borders and allowing them to find refuge in neighboring countries. There is sex trafficking, where people are exploited for sex. And we already see Thomson Reuters just issued a report that there has been a multi-hundred-fold increase in online searches for Ukrainian women escorts in the last 2 weeks. So we already see an increase on the demand side for that activity. Ukraine has been a country that has exported women for sex. Throughout Europe, it is one of those places that is focused on by people before the war ever happened. And so, again, it remains a very important focus for sex trafficking. Labor trafficking is another real threat that is present now in Ukraine on the border. And it is one that is going to ripen over time if these individuals can't go back. Labor trafficking comes again in various kinds. One is called debt bondage, where someone says, for $1,000, I'll get you into a job and you can work there. And then when you get there, what you find is you're paying wages to your trafficker. They keep all your wages to pay back the debt. Oh, and didn't I tell you that debt's incurring interest? And so I just keep getting all of your money. And you're now in debt bondage. And oh, by the way, I took your passport. You don't speak the language. So I put you in a job where it says you don't speak the language. You are now my slave, and you can't escape. Unless you think that can't happen in modern day Europe, one of the clients who we represent victims of trafficking in various kinds of proceedings. She was in debt bondage and another kind of servitude called domestic servitude, where you get into that situation in a domestic, a housekeeper, a babysitter, a place where women come alone with a child, and I very well enough. She was living 2 blocks from the US Capitol. She was working for a diplomat. And she was found crawling on her hands and knees near death on the street in the middle of Washington. And so that was one of the clients who we represented as she was seeking justice for that treatment. But it happens in suburban Washington. It happens in Europe today. And it's part of what we need to protect citizens against. And then there is also just outright modern slavery, where, and we see this in the United States, where you pick up people from desperate places, you bring them to the United States and you say you're going to work in the straight industry. You don't know anyone with a trailer, and that trailer is locked every night. You are picked up, you are taken into, say, the fields. You are picked up at the end of the day and returned to the trailer. And at the end of a year and a half, you're sent home. Oh, so sorry. And all the money that you earned went to trafficking. So labor trafficking, sex trafficking, people smuggling, all of these things are at risk. And one of the other things that we do that again we worry about is online child sexual exploitation. And this is where children are abused online, with people watching online, who order in real time what they want done, and then they take their children's. This is the kind of human trafficking that exists in the world today. And we're going to talk a little bit about the prevalence, what do we know about the extent to which it's happening in Ukraine. And I may be taught something here. I don't think we have prevalence data yet. I don't think we know yet. And at least for us, we're not going to wait for that, because that prevalence data is human suffering person by person by person. So we're not waiting for that. We're asking, what can we do? Because we know that Ukraine presents this toxic food. You touched on it, the ambassador touched on it. What do we know gives rise to people who are sufficiently desperate that they fall into these situations? And many of them aren't doing it by choice. Many of them are doing it because they think they're making a smart decision about getting a job in this wonderful person's house, taking care of their children. Why would I be afraid of that? It is women and children traveling alone, people who have no money, and even people who have money can't get it out of the banks in Ukraine. So not only they are surrounded by the best people in the world who are opening their homes, opening their cars, wanting to help them. And one of the really reverse and heartbreaking things about this is that the greatest human goodness provides the opportunity for the greatest human evil. And how do you train people? How do you teach them what to look out for to avoid them? We see situations where there is a lack of preparation, a lack of planning, a lack of language skills, lack of familiarity with how much should I get paid, or is there really a rule that the broker who got me the job gets my wages? Like maybe that's just how they do it in Poland. Right? All of these different factors are things that victims of trafficking need to know. So you may ask why I'm lawyers up here, because we don't have people who are hiring us who have already been trafficked, who are great. Why are we up here? Because one of the things that lawyers do is they solve really complex problems. So they take a huge much of a problem and they think through a legal sequence to do this. And one of the things that I was privileged to work with Deb on here is awareness training. Awareness training for the women and children themselves first, and second, for those frontline workers who intersect with them. As Deb mentioned, healthcare system people intersect with them. We do a lot of training for banks. How do you identify when somebody comes into a bank with another person, approaches a money machine? What are the indicia that that person is being tracked? We also represent a lot of big clients, big corporate clients. That's what we do. And so we work with them. If you're a big airline, how do you see when somebody is traveling with somebody who might not really be with them? How do you intercept them? If you're a trucker and you happen to see somebody at a truck stop, how do you know the difference and what do you do? All of those trainings of real world things that people can do to interdict trafficking is where we think we have an opportunity. So what do we see? We just did a big landscape scan, and we also have, I should digress very quickly, we just finished a 2-year project, which is the Compendium of the Law of Human Trafficking. You may be surprised to know that there's no standardized resource for what are the laws of human trafficking in every country in the world. So we thought that needed to be done. Nobody was doing it, so we did it. And we're launching the first segment of it. We haven't done all the countries yet, but we're well into it. We're doing it along the Rotary on June 2nd. It is a resource that will help everybody understand what human trafficking is, what the resources are, what the laws are. So that's going to be out there. But in the information surround, we did a scan and we saw tons of information pieces by tons of people. Some legitimate, some not. But even the legitimate ones, they were just tons and tons and tons of information. Often running migrants who are getting off the trains, flyer, they're traumatized, they can't think straight, they can't make decisions, they can't. And so what we have decided to undertake is a project that will provide awareness information to the refugees and to the frontline workers in a form that is understandable, useful, helpful, and effective, that will get them to trusted resources and will be delivered to them in a time, place, and manner that they are open to receive it and that they need to receive it. What does that mean to us? What that means is the synthesization, that's a word, and digitization of awareness. Okay, so what we're doing now is we are working with a series of organizations, some nonprofits, some governmental, quasi-governmental organizations, to collect all of the awareness material that's already out there. We're gonna, some of which is done by Global Strategic Operatives, and it's outstanding, let me just say that. Synthesize all of that into best of class information, to translate it into all of the relevant languages, and then to work with some of the platform companies to do what is called a redirect. So if you, I'm gonna do this for the women, sort of for the men, just follow me on this. So if you wanna go buy a green dress, right? You start searching for green dress. Did you ever notice that like a green dress pops up, or if you're searching for a book on a topic, like a thing pops up? Right? That's a technology called redirect technology. And so we are working with NGOs and technology companies to use that redirect technology so that when someone searches, I'm leaving to the border, or I think I've been approached, or I'm afraid of, or I'm looking for, or should I take a job, you know, that it will immediately bring up the warning language on the particular topic in the language most relevant to the person when they need to see it and how they need to see it. And so it's one of the opportunities that we see where we could be useful and just start putting one foot in front of the other. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. Sometimes the problem is so huge and so overwhelming that it is paralyzing. And one of the things that we tried to do that you did when you were there is just find one thing that you can do and just start doing it. One foot in front of the other. Ask what you can do, who do you know that can help you do it, organize them and go do it. And I was so touched by this film because that's what we saw in this film, is people just doing what they could do, where they could do it, one step at a time. So that's our step.
Oh my gosh. If you can imagine and appreciate that Laura Ellsworth is a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of experience. And you give out a lot of credit. And I want to return that credit to her because we were talking one Friday afternoon, right? And we were just saying, it's similar to what you were just saying. What's that one thing that we could do? And we really were just so distraught hearing about these women and children and just disappearing when the women would come in exhausted and hungry and tired, and the child was sent up to go get a blanket or some food, and often the child never be seen again. Or in those cars, never be seen again. What can we do? And it was really brainstorming with, I call Laura on a whim, and she calls me, and it's just wonderful when we get to brainstorm. And we talked about that awareness training. And that awareness training is great when you have an audience, right? Dr. Coralanne, of the healthcare people, and the business, or the airport pilots, and the flight attendants. But these are women and children that are coming from a war zone that are already traumatized. And they're doubly traumatized when they get picked up traffickers. What could we tell them? And people were trying to do what was good. They were trying to with good hearts, but they were handing out pamphlets. How many people? Romania had pretty good banners, and then they were doing well, and they were training people at that border. But we learned about, and Maltese was trying to, and they had. So we tried to collect as much as we could. And what we have, and I'll show it to you, I'll leave it up here, but this was what was called, and this was your idea, yes, it was a push communication. And I said, Laura, what do you mean by push communication? I'm going to digress for a minute, we'll get to everybody. But the push communication was, she said, when my husband and I go to Caribbean, all of a sudden you go to the airspace and you get, welcome to Antigua. That's the push communication for a cell phone. And what a great idea. No matter how tired, you first learn everyone in the world has a cell phone. No matter what undeveloped countries, they all have cell phones. And secondly, they will answer that ding. And that's a proven, Pavlov's dog type of ding that people listen to. And this is something that we picked up. And instead of saying the word traffickers, like beware of kidnappers, they don't even know the thought of what is a trafficker. And then don't take your eyes off your children for a second. And these are very practical things. And if you have to get in that car, make sure you know X, Y, and Z, and take a picture of the driver and take a picture of the license plate and things like that. You know, and then we got them translated 6 languages, including English, and working with CEOs of cell phone companies within Eastern Europe. And so this was just one of those things, but you've taken it to a next level, Laura. The digitization, the redirect, all that is so amazing that it just bumps it up to the next level. And that's how no one person, no one organization can conquer this problem. And that's why that 4P is partnerships. And if we don't work together, we're done for it. So thank you so much. I had other questions, but you answered them as you talked. I was wonderful. But I want to, we'll go back. We'll circle back with everyone. Next, I want to introduce Joel Millman, a former reporter for the Wall Street Journal, covering global issues, immigration in the Pacific Northwest. Joel opened a satellite office from the U.S.-Mexican border in San Diego some time ago, which I'm sure we could share some thoughts on with this current crisis. Joel has a fascinating background, which also includes being a research fellow at the Institute of Current World Affairs, working in El Salvador, where he won awards for being on a team covering political corruption and drug running crisis in Latin America. All very relevant to today's issues. Thank you for being with us today, Joel, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Bishop and Deborah. Excellent presentation for the meeting. I'm not going to be a long statement, but I do want to set some context. Deborah did not mention that I left journalism 8 years ago. I said that actually 8 of the last 8 years working in the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, for the International Organization for Migration as a press officer. And during that arc of time, literally being at dawn at a hillside in Serbia, when 15,000 Syrians just had caves, woods, almost as if it were a rock festival. Whole families were taking bags and clothes, moving through this chain. In fact, my colleague at Europe from Turkish news agency remembers that time very well when the surge of migrants from Syria and Afghanistan were causing the Mediterranean. And I can tell you, and I was going to mention this a little later in the moment, human trafficking is deeply involved with legal trafficking, legal migration. Wherever there's a snag or a chokehold or a problem moving quickly from one district location towards safety, which is what most migration. Traffickers are extremely adept at adapting their practices and taking advantage of that. So we saw that all through that period of clear warnings that people were fleeing Syria, that the food ration stored value cards that refugees often got in Turkey wasn't sufficient. I think it was $1 a day per person in value, and there were warnings that if you don't bump it to $1.50 or $2, they won't stay. And surely it didn't stay. That's almost immediately, and that was the consequence of a much bigger phenomenon that we had to grapple with. So I want to give you a little context. Laura mentioned absence so far of statistics. The International Organization for Migration has had since 2014 a very large presence in Ukraine. We in that office, of course, we understand February 24th was 3 months ago. This is the 3rd-month anniversary of this current offensive. But we have treated that location as a war location with all the problems of migration and human trafficking since 2014. And I just had checked the organization's web page this morning. They identified in the first couple of days for a few weeks after this current offensive began on February 24th, 1,000 cases, some cases of trafficking victims. But that compares to 46,000 identified in 3 years, 2019, 2020, 2021. So going back even 3 years ago, we were tens of thousands of years per year. And also the IOM established a hotline for anyone who had any questions whatsoever about what could be a potential human trafficking incident. And they got, according to their records, 2,400 calls in the first 20 days. So they're running more than 100 a day. You can say that's 1 minute, pretty much, in every hour. So this is something we know that's engaged with this whole now almost a decade of conflict in that part of the country, that part of Europe. I also wanted to point out that the treatment of legitimate migrants, even documented migrants, that gets distorted and hijacked by trafficking is one of the trickiest parts, and Joe Laura has seen lots of this as well. People answer ads for what they think are real jobs, and they get documents that allow them to go. I would call, I'm actually still in touch with one woman in Kenya that's happened to Ethiopians and Kenyans who were sent up to Lebanon under very strict government rules to be domestic cleaners, house cleaners, very quickly getting trafficked to other Arabic-speaking countries where they become slaves. In the case of Kelly and a woman named I forget the woman's name. Kelly was from Kenya. She and another woman from East Africa were sold to Saudi. Those Saudis had business interests in Puerto Ordaz, Venezuela, and they were flown across the Atlantic. And in one case, they actually took on a third girl from Frankfurt and they changed planes and were distributed to expatriate Arab families in Venezuela. These women left legally, they left their countries legally under the protection of their government, and then something happened in the Middle East and they sold to someone else who then trafficked them to South America. Very, very difficult work getting them saved. I only did that with the help of Interpol and others. The women didn't know the language was being spoken. They didn't know what country they were in. They were given instructions usually by Facebook to another family member they all had phones, everybody has a phone, and they were told to take pictures of car license plates. That allowed the authorities to say, well, what country are they in? And then after many weeks, more instructions on there's a church near you, go to that church, get on Facebook at the rectory, and we will send them to rescue you. And both these women came home. So one of them still on what's that? Had a second child. So that there are good endings, and I want to segue into one bit of happy news. For those of us who have been doing this as long as I have, I'm shocked and happy with this long. But a lot of old timers now, especially a few years ago, when we had the anniversary, celebrating 1980 as the year when the world pulled together for massive refugee and chaotic emergency situation of migration. You had the invasion of Afghanistan, which close to 3 million people went to Pakistan. You had Mariel boat lift that year. Untold hundreds of thousands leaving Cuba by a small boat across the Caribbean. And of course, the continuing Southeast Asian, mostly boat people, post-Cambodia, refugee emergency in Southeast Asia. And we all remember, seriously, when I was in refugee work camp too, the way barriers and bureaucratic glitches all fell. All the countries pulled together, from Australia to France to Japan, Canada. The happiest moment I had in Geneva these past few years was when we had a conference on Syria in '7, and one of our speakers in Canada from Saskatchewan, a Vietnamese and now Canadian citizen, now a doctor, was one of our clients in 1970, and she is now helping Syrians settle in Canada. And she told everyone the night before the Syrian family came, she went onto a stuffed tiger to get to the little girl, because when she came from Vietnam in 1978, somebody gave her one of those. I'm sure there wasn't a dry eye in the council. So it just was an arc of all those years of one refugee helping a new refugee. And it made me very proud to be doing this kind of work. So as dire as things are and as troubling, we do have to remember the triumphs as well. And so I hope we have to see more of them in the years ahead.
Thank you, Joe.
Sure.
Very quickly though, follow up. As a journalist viewpoint, how do you compare it to other crises we've seen? And do you think there's more that can be done without media? I mean, you're all saying how it's such a lack of reporting on this topic.
Oh, so that's a great big subject of a question, but I mean, look, to move out of journalism into the humanitarian sphere was very very revealing for me. I told colleagues, especially when I do workshops on media coverage, how strongly immigration and migration coverage in the world is defined by law enforcement terms. How many apprehensions, how long it should stay with visa. Migrants don't think of those things. They have very strong feelings of what we're doing, safety, feeding my family, feeding my own opportunity to match my education with occupation. Can't do in my country. These are the kind of things that are a huge disconnect. And we've got to break away from writing about why they're doing this to us and why they're trespassing in our high-income country. And we feel that way because we've set up all these regulations. And as I said, we begin with the more dense the regulations are, the more opportunity there are for traffickers to end up in all the abuses. And we as a society tends to throw up our hands and say, well, why don't they just stay where they were? And we would have this problem. That's the wrong answer. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much. Our next guest, Dr. Coralanne Griffiths-Hunte. She conducts training and development programs across the globe. And very interested in hearing more about that, even though I wanted to, Dr. Coralanne. These trainings include trauma-informed care, mental health, trauma support, sexual violence, human trafficking response care. And she is based right here in New York City, in SUNY, but is also a senior legislative advisor who works to pass legislation on the state, local, and federal levels in favorable to education, human rights, mental health, anti-human trafficking, anti-domestic violence, and anti-dating. Fascinating background, wealth of information. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador, for allowing me into this space and the fellow panelists. I'm honored to be here with you all today. As a human industrial and trauma psychologist, I get the opportunity to see human trafficking and the atrocities of that from a different standpoint. I've trained Homeland Security, NYPD. I have been involved in rescues and recoveries of bodies. So when I come to the table, it's to say to the mom that it wasn't you that did this to your child. I think of the words of Desmond Tutu that states, "My humanity is bound up in your humanity, for we can only be human together." So why discuss this? Because it's happening to humanity. And the bigger picture is not us doing work separately, but collaboratively in order to bring an end. And some people say, well, this will never end. Well, I can't go about it with that perspective. I have to believe that collectively, God has summoned us to bring an end to human trafficking. What we have done is we have made some people comfortable by not talking about this. So this is courageous conversation today. You're in a space of courageous conversation because when we speak to this, what we acknowledge is we are moving individuals from safe spaces. Individuals in the Ukraine, before all of this started, many of them thought they would be safe in their country. I've seen individuals in Africa and Haiti and India, and even here in America feel as though they were safe, but not protected. There's a difference. And so as a clinician, I travel the globe to train other clinicians and leadership about what is safe space versus protective space. What does collective trauma look like? What we experience in COVID is what is called collective trauma. That's when a society experiences the same thing pretty much together. But what we don't talk about is where are those individuals getting the medication that they need? They're in a war. So someone comes and says, hey, I'll provide you the medication. Just, come with me, I'll help out. I'm in desperate need. What about the medication not even being for me, the mom, but for my child? What about I will help you. You see, I think that what we tend to, the verbiage is, oh, you know, if they look like me, I can trust them. These traffickers are not coming looking like, you know, these big, horrible looking individuals. I've had to lock up social workers. They come looking like me. They come looking like you. They come saying, I'll help. What does help look like? We've had to rescue a little 9-year-old boy. And I remember when we walked in Homeland Security, the little boy said, did you bring the white stuff so that it wouldn't hurt? So this is conversation that's uncomfortable, but it's even more uncomfortable than 1,000 individuals violate your body. It's more uncomfortable. The thing that I walked away from with that experience was that little boy did not know when freedom walked in the door. How do I identify someone that's seeking to bring me harm versus someone who's seeking to take me through the journey to wholeness and to help? So it's about bringing awareness. We repeat what we don't repair. And we've been doing that for years. We've been repeating the same practices. Clinicians need to be able to know that we cannot go about this from a pathogenic standpoint, because a pathogenic standpoint is binary. And when I say that, I mean, if my nose is bleeding and you help me, you know, to cause my nose to stop bleeding, and I say, I'm not in pain anymore, you say, okay, my work is done. As a clinician, as a trauma expert, I know the work is not done, because guess what? What caused the nose to bleed? So when we're talking about individuals experiencing trauma, because that's what's happening, the individuals in the Ukraine right now, as I speak to my fellow colleagues and in the United Nations, I sit on a committee at the White House, and we're having these conversations. We're conversing about, wait a minute, how do we implement the correct change so that individuals can come to a place of wholeness? It's not just about there's a war going on, because you know what? Individuals were experiencing this atrocity before the war occurred. So they're coming with complexities of trauma previously. Trauma is divorce for them. Trauma is a car accident, the loss of a job. What could affect me and be traumatic may not affect Steve the same way. We have to be able to cater to both individuals correctly. We have to be able to say, you know what, these individuals experience sexual abuse, sexual violence, verbal abuse way before the war occurred. So now when we're dealing with that, we have to understand that we're treating previous trauma and current trauma that they are experiencing. And that takes a lot, because the journey to wholeness is not a one size fits all. It is not we can't, trauma doesn't have an expiration date, let me put it like that. And so to cater to these individuals, we have to know that we're coming not to fix symptoms, but to see the truth, to see what they have experienced. And it's tough. It's a hard job to look at a mom and say, how do we help to find your child? We've had a young woman that came to us, and she came to the United States because a missionary went to her family and said, we'll provide for your children. And her children left Africa and came to America, and the children were raped. That's another thing that we need to change. Children do not have sex with an adult. Adults violate children. Adults rape children. We need to use the verbiage that's correct. The truth of the matter is, harm is occurring. The truth of the matter is, we need everyone's voice. In 2018, after 6 years of fighting with legislators here in New York, we were able to pass the End Child Sex Trafficking Bill here in New York City. It took us 6 years to make legislators understand how vital it was not to have children testify in court. Everyone's voice is essential. Everyone's voice matters. And we cannot say, well, you know, the lawyer isn't necessary at the table, the business individual isn't necessary at the table. We're all necessary at the table, because this is happening to your brothers and your sisters. Why do I say your brothers and your sisters? Because you're part of humanity. There's a saying, if you're here with us unfaithfully, you're doing terrible damage. Have you been faithful to humanity? Why aren't we speaking about what's happening at the Ukrainian border? Why aren't we seeing? Why are we being distracted by other things? Baby formula. We're talking a lot about that, but we're not talking about the atrocities of human trafficking. The members in Ukraine. We need to start talking about that. And at the White House, that's what we've been doing. I've been bringing the topic up. There's a difference between, you know, mental health, and some of the individuals that you don't even think about that some of those individuals that's being harmed have mental health issues. So there's so much that's going on medically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, physiologically, spiritually. All of those needs need to be met. And it's about getting fellow clinicians to understand we cannot go about this how we are accustomed going about this, but that we have to meet individuals at the point of their need. Preventative measures need to be put in place, yes, but reparative measures is going to be those individuals that we're going to be faced with to try to bring them to on this journey to wholeness. Reparative measures, and it's going to cost resources, and that's another conversation that we're not having. Where are the resources to help individuals that are experiencing what they have experienced? And so that's why I'm grateful that we're having this conversation, because as a clinician, I know that those individuals, trauma causes diabetes, trauma causes high blood pressure, trauma causes cancer, trauma causes, there's not a system in your body that is not affected by trauma. And they are in complex trauma, multiple levels of trauma. And so I thank you for allowing me in this space, because we have to bring awareness to, it's not just trafficking that we have to face, but that trauma from trafficking is also leading to medical issues. And I continue to train and bring awareness about this because it's so pertinent for us to talk about.
Dr. Coralanne, you are just music to my ears, truly, because everything you're saying, I've been thinking about the double trauma, I almost call it, because of the Ukraine. So what are we going to do with the healthcare providers to really get them prepared for this unbelievable generation of people that have the complexities, the complex trauma that they just came from, the trauma of war, and they came from the trauma of all the other issues, and then on top of it, then they're violated of the trust that's violated. So it's not blood or reparatively. Thank you for being here. Okay, let me try that. So I was going to say an old friend again, but no, this is a long-term friend and colleague, Stephen Procopio. We've known each other for almost 10 years. Stephen, it's so good to see you. Always good to see you. Now, Stephen is an expert in what is sadly an ever-increasing abuse, the sexual victimization of young boys, adolescent males, trans youth, and men in the United States. Steve's a licensed clinical social worker who's a trainer, consultant, and therapist. He's the founder of the first freestanding program to serve commercially sexually exploited boys. He consults with the Office of Victims of Crime, Human Trafficking Center, the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center, and is a member of the UN Global Human Trafficking Task Force. And Stephen, I so look forward to your comments, but I also just applaud you because I know your expertise is. So thank you for all you
Thank
do.
you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador. So I'm from Boston, the great state of, which is the great state of Massachusetts. I promise my call the So as Deb mentioned, back in 2007, I founded the first freestanding project for traffickers in the United States. As a result of my human trafficking, and most of my work down to my work with boys, and then would have a history of childhood sexual abuse. So I, at Washington University, where I was a faculty advisor in a field education program, a colleague of mine did a presentation on her work with trafficked girls. And before the presentation, she said, well, before I tell you about my project with trafficked girls, I want to know I actually work with girls. We kind of, sort of think it happens to boys. We kind of, sort of think it's less than 10%. And we kind of, sort of think it's just the gay mix. So, in holding truth to my Italian heritage, my blood started to boil, but I behaved like I wanted to. And there was something about that, I did not have a background in trafficking that I just couldn't wrap my head around as being the truth. So if those know about social workers, we always hold truth to our intuition. So I took her out for a Jewish friend to the best Jewish deli in Boston. I had the greatest Jewish food, and I pumped her for information. Why? There's no data. There was no research done on boys, except for a Dr. McIntyre ended up with a PhD dissertation about it. I did lit reviews, not one thing in 2007 about trafficking or exploited boys. So, being very polite to me, after 2 hours, I could see she was getting pleasantly friendly, annoyed. And basically said, Stephen, if you think it's such an issue, why don't you do something yourself about it? So that's when I tell people I had my Oprah moment. Because Oprah is always an opportunity, but we have a passion to go for that. So that became my passion. So in those 5 years, I did a lot of work. I interviewed tons of people in the trafficking community. I got tons of pushback. This is not real. It doesn't happen. The boys on the street are doing it of their own free will. So, there was many nights when I would go home and I would feel incredibly defeated because I couldn't find an organization involved that would give me a seat money to at least start the process of research and investigation. And clearly the federal government gave life for some great civil debts. And we were denied, even though we bring out high grade, we were denied because the feds like data and my research. My research is talking to the boys on the street. That's where I got my information. My program, how to develop programmatic, is I talk to the boys on the street, asking them, what do you need to get out of the life? What are you not being provided to help you get out of the life? So luckily, by 2012, I did get money to start providing services. And just sort of was grown on the national scene at that point, because I was the only person in the country doing the work. So I ended up traveling around the country a lot, providing training and technical assistance for program development, information to organizations around the country, Canada, United Kingdom, and Costa Rica. And it was amazing to me how it manifests very similarly both within this country and outside of it. I realized that the situation in Ukraine right now is on the front pages. Almost on the front pages. We know that the Ukraine situation is a crisis. We know people are getting steadily worried about it. It's just not many people. It's adult men and boys. And my whole goal over these years was to begin to change the narrative about those being victimized by human trafficking. And the reason why we don't have any boys disclosing is that they're not a part of the narrative. The adult male survivors of trafficking I see now in therapy, I'd have to tell them at 62 years old, you were trafficked. That was trafficking. They have no definition of what that is. And then you have the other segment of the population that live in shame and guilt. I should have stopped it. I'm a guy. I've had men disclose to their families. Why didn't you stop it? You should have told them not to do it. You should have walked away from it. So all these dynamics really between the narrative and the shame and the guilt pushes men and boys underground. And there's, I'm sad to say that human trafficking and the work around it is not inclusive. It's not including men, teenage boys, and boys. And there's still segments of the human trafficking community that push back on this topic. After all these years I've done this, I still get pushback more towards the opening, but we really need to begin to change the narrative. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It doesn't matter what age you are. It doesn't matter what your gender identification is. It doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is. Traffickers want to apply for market. $140 billion a year. That's cut. So the trap, if a buyer wants a boy, the trapper will provide more. The trapper wants adult women, that person will get it supplied and so forth and so on. The trackers are there to support the needs of the market and to make money for them. They don't care what other want. So I think, and just proceeding with my work now, I left my programs. I'm now consulting on this particular topic. I'm so glad I was able to be here today to keep in mind my politics around here too. And so with that, I think the Ukraine situation is not unique. What's happening in Ukraine today is happening in every state of the United States right now, in every country in the world right now, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So we can appreciate what's happening and have a lot of, I'm heartsick of what this guy has done to Ukraine and the aftereffects of the war. I can't even want to do something. But I'm also aware and heartsick of what else I know about what's happening in this world 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And as
That's why I'm talking about.
yeah, no, that's beautiful. And as we spoke, it isn't equal. It is not equal because we all know that there are many, many safe homes for women and children. And I can count them on one hand, maybe even just a few fingers of how many are for boys in this country. And we won't even talk about, across, in other countries. So we'll hold that for some discussion. Okay, last but not least, I have the pleasure to introduce Melissa Ketsouris. Melissa is also an attorney who has practiced immigration law for several years. And prior to this, she was with the UN as an advisor to the permanent mission of Greece, where she covered multiple issues regarding migration. She's an active member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Thank you for being here today, Melissa, and look forward to your comments. You have the floor.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you for all these speakers. It's such a great panel, and I'm honored to be on it. So I spent the last week at the IRS, so I'd like to make comments on what I learned there and things that can be applied to the Ukrainian situation. So what did we learn from each other as UN member states, stakeholders, civil society, and migrants themselves gathered at the UN to discuss the implementation of the global compact on migration? Some of my key takeaways are the following. First, regular pathways can save lives. Member states should provide them to migrants fleeing precarious situations, and they should be available from local grounds. If migrants are made aware of pathways to migrate to safe countries of destination and can start the migration process swiftly in their home country or a country of destination for transit, this can prevent them from embarking on dangerous migration journeys. Second, irregular migration will continue. Humanitarian actors, as well as member states, should apply group-based approaches and reach migrants on the ground to provide them with legally needed and forms of information to apply for regular pathways. This could play a role in their decisions to embark on deadly migration routes. Third, special attention must be paid to the unique vulnerability of young children and migrants, who make up a large population of Ukrainian refugees coming into Europe and other countries. And they are also especially at risk of trafficking. Proper screening and reception at borders, as well as basic and psychosocial services, should be provided to them at countries of destination. And they should also be tailored to address their specific needs and also the trauma that they may face during migration journeys. Trafficking victims should also be afforded security and be provided humanitarian status in their countries of destination. Fourth, as more volunteers come forward to help Ukrainian refugees in countries of transit and destination, all governments and humanitarian organizations should have a structured system to properly vet volunteers and register refugees to help identify Ukrainians who are at risk of trafficking. Oftentimes, as we discussed, predators approach refugees who are the most desperate and offer them things like transportation, shelter, food, or ride. And a lot of migrants wind up in precarious situations because of this. Proper vetting and identification systems could prevent Ukrainians from falling prey to predatory schemes and stop human traffickers from exploiting them. Fifth, human traffickers must face repercussions for their actions. Neighboring countries should prioritize anti-trafficking mechanisms as the crisis in Ukraine continues. More resources should be deployed to detect trafficking schemes at borders and they must monitor trafficking activities that prevent kidnapping. Government should also welcome and assist migrants and help them access justice and work with them to prosecute their abusers. Finally, multilateralism is essential in migration management. Countries that are receiving the most Ukrainian refugees, such as Poland, Moldova, Hungary, Slovakia, should work together to form policies and agreements that manage this mass migration effectively and protect vulnerable Ukrainians. No one country can manage migration alone. Migrants should also be at the table when policies are being made to protect them. As crises develop in all corners of Europe, member states should practice universal policies and protect the human rights and dignity of migrants to prevent them from ending up in precarious situations.
Thank you so much. A round of applause for this. We'll have some time to open it up to the floor. If any of you have some questions that you have for a panelist, please raise your hand. You can, if there's anything, Stefan was trying to chat online, and then maybe some online. But you know, I think what we're trying to do now is trying to compile everything that we've now heard, which is a lot. And this is where we come to a crossroad of what can we actually practically do today? And you heard outlined some from your most recent meeting, Warsaw. But it's we talked about that push communication, we talked about the digitization, we talked about the complexity of trauma, I mean, and trying to continue that training out there. But is there something that, missing some thread that goes through this? Anyone that, please, anyone speak up,
Let me jump in.
please, Joe.
All right, so for many years, I had entertained groups up in this size, all kinds of universities and civil society groups that come in. And I found the most effective thing that I could do, and I'll do it now if you want, is ask you, does anyone know what's the first thing the world wants from migrants? It doesn't matter what country, where they're coming from, or where they're going to. What's the one thing that everybody wants migrants to do? Does anyone have an idea? No, that's close. That's not what I was thinking. It's the first-
Votes.
Any other they say get a job, some people come and say learn the language. No, they want them to come. That's the first thing. And the second thing is usually leave. Now, this was a system in global migration that existed almost, actually, some scholars say it existed unchanged virtually since ancient times, all the way to 1918. The first passport and visa system went into effect, which was at the moment an emergency measure until the end of World War I. So we celebrated the 100th anniversary of that a few years ago. It wasn't temporary. But that was what migration was, and that's what a city was, and that's what civilization was about. So all these tribes from the hinterland come into the Mediterranean before the city and live peaceably together and speak of being civil to each other because we're not getting our spears and meeting you up, on the mountainside just so we have differences. Most an ancient city ever asked anyone to do was sometimes to register, but there were no formal laws that we couldn't be there. And that was pretty common because the rural to urban migration that it dates back to antiquity. The Bible was just such a natural replenishment of the most prosperous places on earth. It's only in the most recent generations, maybe since the beginning of the middle of the last century, that the rural stranger that comes into our midst probably won't be of our nationality. It may not look like us, may not share our religion. So mankind's been challenged. So my first suggestion to get to Deb's question is, what can we do? We have to begin by recognizing the humanity of all of us and how differences are ephemeral. They're not really important compared to what's similar. And we have to act accordingly, because the harder you make it to come and do that first thing, the harder you make it to leave. And that's why we have the situation there today. They're risking their lives and spending their families' complete savings just to get somewhere to clean a floor or to wash dishes. And often they're killed on route. So the undocumented migrant, and this is true in every country in the world, it's true in Japan, it's true in Europe, it's true in the United States. At that high cost, no one can afford to do it more than once. So nobody goes home unless they're deported. And it never used to be that way. Back and forth was almost equal. Most of the history. And people were very comfortable with that. But we changed it, we as a society, and that has to change that. That's my
I'm sorry. Sort of to play on that humanity, I think one thing that we can do, and I think that maybe we order most can do as well as anybody else in the world, is the humanity. To not train about things and forces and objective people, but to tell the stories of the people. And I think if you think what you'll remember from this presentation, I think you'll remember the stories of some of the people who all talked about, the individual stories. And I'll just share one with you. It was a young we had just been brought in. He was involved in that criminal sex trafficking ring. And I had laid my cell phone on the table. And my cell phone went off, didn't go off for you today, Deb, just took it. My cell phone went off, and this kid jumped out of his skin. And I said, no, don't worry about it. Just hit resend and call that person back and leave it. He didn't know that a cell phone would be used to call out. What he knew is that he would get instructions over that cell phone about what he needs to do. And that level of control over a little boy, a little child, is what trafficking is all about. It is, you know, the young girl who lived upstairs in my neighborhood, private school, straight A student, absolutely, that was wonderful parents, totally involved in her upbringing. And she was recruited by a guy online to go modeling. She could be modeled, she could be a fabulous model. She disappeared in the night, she was gone for 3 years in a trafficking situation. And so if there is a way, as part of these trainings and awareness raisings, that we can just tell the stories of how this happened, how a woman who just wanted to go to work in an exciting country and clean somebody's house and take care of her kids became a trafficking victim. If these stories could be told in a way through the distribution system of the Order of Malta, we talked about it. The people who belong to the order are the most influential, respected people in their communities. If those people could somehow be engaged to tell the stories of these human beings, and just as you were saying, right? Just understand these people, they could be me. That could have been my daughter. It could have been my son. It could have been me. I absolutely would have gone babysitting and housecleaning to live in an exciting Middle Eastern country. Could have been any of us. So that's one thing that I would suggest is if we could find a way to just tell stories through your network, I think it would be a powerful message.
It's extremely powerful, Dr. Carol. Yes, what you had said of the white powder and what occurred, I talked to the Homeland Security people that were in one of those states and heard the same thing, and I repeat that just because people need to hear that a little boy was saying, I can give you that, well, that stuff that makes it not hurt. Right. And as hard that is, and most people are very uncomfortable, but the stories will be present.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know, that's another part that we don't talk about, right? The fact that substances are used to numb individuals, and you know, I just want to say a couple of things as it relates to what we can do as part of that training. Have that training be survivor led. You know, Steve and I have worked together on curriculum that is actually being taught through an organization that sits on the board called Unitas. And so the Department of Education, which is like the largest department of education in our country, it's being taught right here in New York. It's called Lights, right? And the thing that is so essential is, and I've said it and I will continue to say it, we are experts because we went to school and we learned, you know, information, we ascertained information. And so after that, we work and we bring, you know, individuals to the place of wholeness through all these various strategies that we have learned. But in actuality, the expert is the one who experienced the trafficking. It's not us. And I think sometimes we get caught up thinking that it's us. But the person who experienced it, hear their voice. Just to piggyback on what you said, their stories. And we don't do justice by us telling the stories. Provide the platform for them to share when they're ready. But know that there is a story and validate that story. When I work with police departments, I always say to them, or you know, even lawyers, I say, don't be so quick to get them to testify. Come on, push that story out. Let's lock this John up. You're doing them a disservice because we have to understand that even in them sharing their story, how does the brain regulate it? Them sharing the story, though something could have happened to that individual once, the brain registers it. Every time they share that story of healing has not taken place, the brain is sending a message that is happening right there, right now. Another thing we need to understand is it's not going to, the story won't be told chronologically. And so what we've done to individuals is we said, oh, you're lying then, because we want it chronologically. That's not how the brain operates once someone is sharing their story. And we've seen it on the news. We've watched cases and we said, that person got it lying because they didn't do it, you know, in a chronological way. It's because the brain doesn't understand it that way. The prefrontal cortex was turned off during that trauma, and their emotional brain was turned on. And so it's to understand that we have to make room for the expert to speak. And in the training, you know what has been so powerful? Watching clergy, because clergy is a tapestry of our community. Our priests, our imams, our pastors, our bishops. When something happens in community, believe it or not, we seek the guidance of our faith leaders. So one of the key components to this training and this development is actually having clergy understand that when someone comes, what's happening is you're doing psychological first aid, whether you know it or not. And to be able to know what are the resources that's in community to help an individual that has had the boldness to say, it has happened to me. You know, like when Steve mentioned, that individual said, wait a minute, it was you that brought them to the place of, I was trafficked. Understand that in some cultures, that is the norm. You're not trauma informed if you're not culturally informed. You're not trauma informed if you're not religiously informed. Just because something is culture does not make it right. And so even that narrative needs to change. And so those are kind of the components that's so necessary to have the expert, the one with the lived experience speak out, to include our clergy in this conversation and to train our clergy to identify and for them to also know where the resources are. And do not give our clergy, you know, don't give them a hard time because there may not be the psychologist and psychiatrist, but they can lead individuals to that space that's protective. Know the difference between protective space and safe space. Now, I'm a brown girl. I can go down to East New York, Brooklyn, and I might be safe. I might be protected, but someone else may not be able to go to Brooklyn and be safe. So don't assume that just because something is safe for you, that it's safe for me. But protective space, we are all okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and we have, I know our Global Strategic Operatives, survivor-led, and really it doesn't matter after we all talk, it's the survivor who really is the star of the show. I think Bishop and then you, and I think we will wrap it up.
Thank you, Doctor. That was just to let you know, too, the church continues to evolve and appreciate those needs. I've been teaching at the seminary for 15, 16 years, and part of my curriculum was to present to these young men concerning priesthood that they could very easily and often are the first point of contact. But I also tell them they're not psychologists. Never pretend. Know your space, you know. But often people will come, sometimes because they can't afford to go to a psychologist, and whether it's in sacrament or simply in counseling or a conversation, seek help. And we do have resources, we do direct them, and it can literally change a person's life forever. But in regard to one of the questions that I have, as you said, what can we do? I've heard everyone talk beautifully about the story, you know. How do you keep the story alive, especially specifically in trafficking? Because the world's attention span is very short. One student at the Ukrainian University in Lviv asked him, I said, what are you worried most about? Okay. He said, I appreciate everything America and the West is doing for us. I'm afraid they're going to forget us. And then he said, I pray that at least the support and the attention continues until your midterm elections. Because after that, we are not going to be on the news anymore. And that was jarring. But he's right, you know, and I didn't tell him that. I said, oh, no, you know, I'm sure the story will be alive. But as you mentioned, and legitimately, David Boyle caught people's attention, but it became the first story. The Ukraine went to number 2. And each week, this is not over soon. You know, the Ukrainians told us the war started in 2014. You know, and they're considering that he may take a pause and come back again and finish the job. So it's a long-term affair, but this is the TikTok generation. We do everything in 30 seconds or less. And it's very hard to keep people's attention. Preaching a sermon is an easy. You know, they start coughing and checking the bulletin. So you really have to be concerned. So honestly, one of my biggest fears is like so many stories. Because there are other places in the world where this is happening. And we're not even talking about that. This is the primary interest right now. How do we, that's my concern question, keep the story alive? How do we keep people interested? Because it will wane. And when that wanes, not only will financial support level because we'll be targeting something else, but suddenly it'll be on the back burner. And these things that are happening and have been happening will continue. Now, when I read the state report on Ukraine and trafficking before the war, they had allotted in our dollars equivalent $5,000 to protect those. That's not a lot of money, you know. So now, again, that gives us a sense of the need and priority. So I just hope the story continues and we discover ways like today of keeping it alive.
30 seconds.
Yeah, Dr. Coralanne mentioned around comfortability, and that's the first step. Supervisors will allow the my staff will want to work with these boys to take up issues. And I'm saying that we state child welfare so you need to step up to the plate and take care of kids. So without bias, it would be they would not say that about a girl, but said that about based on bias and a lack of knowing and awareness that I think the human trafficking community needs to be much more inclusive of their narrative. And with providers who we charge with taking care of our kids need to check in with their own biases before they re-victimize the child by not believing them. So those are the critical initial steps that I think need to happen based on uncomfortability.
Thank you, Steve. Anybody else for a quick question of the panelists?
Thanks, Deb.
Yep. Can you speak louder?
I can, sure. I've been very blessed in recent years to represent the Order of Malta on Cardinal O'Malley's Bethlehem project, which works with the homeless in and around Boston. And there's considerable intersection between trafficked children and young women, and probably others I'm unaware of, and the homeless there. So in the project, we have a number of people who work on the clinical side and those who work on the pastoral side. And one area where we've identified a lot of need is reintegration of those who have spent a long time in homelessness. So my question is, are enough resources, government resources and pastoral care, legal frameworks, are enough being leveraged towards reintegration of those who have been trafficked? And what more can be directed to those
Laura?
Can you hear me okay? Okay. So on the legal side, we run a project, we talk about it, where we do what are generally called exploitations. So a lot of times victims of trafficking or homelessness have engaged in petty offenses during the time of their trafficking. So in trafficking, maybe shoplifting, minor drug offenses, taxes might have been filed in the name of this person who never knew what was being done to them, right? And so we will do pro bono efforts, and there are other firms that do this represent them pro bono to erase those records, which can be barriers to housing, employment, being re-engaged with their children, right? And so there are programs that do that, and if you're not attached to one, there's some wonderful ones in the Boston area, and happy to do it. So from a legal perspective, that's an important step, and there are resources. Please. Very quick.
Hi, thank you all so much for this very helpful and useful presentation. I wonder, when borders are closed by the politicians we elect with their anti-rhetoric or anti-migrant rhetorics, how does that contribute to human trafficking? That's what I want to know. It's one of the aspects we have heard from the panelists, and I just wonder if that increases the demand for human traffickers for people who are in desperate need of escaping conflicts or war. Thanks.
It does, but it's a great question, and it's not just any one country's politician who does it. Yeah, I mean, right now, and for many years, the only real practical means of accessing legal entry into the United States, if you can't get a visa in your home country, is via asylum. And the way our courts are structured, and other countries are similar. You can create a story that can't be checked. It can't be checked easily, and at least get permission to stay. I've spent most of the last 10 months in Guatemala. I kept hearing the term, for asylum, you get something that they describe as medio legal, half legal. What they mean is we get a case number, have to report to court in 2 years. Hey, for your purposes, that's half legal. And of course, it does create huge demand for the trafficker to get these people up in Mexico, on the U.S. border. But it also puts a cap on the price, because if you're willing to do it, and it's even cheaper if you bring a minor child with you, then you're presumed to have done a lot of the traffickers work for. So it is very much a business, and it's very much attuned to a political decision in the destination country. So absolutely.
I don't expect if a border gets closed, but the trafficking is going to stop.
No,
It's like the traffic will then just transfer back into that original country and not move them across the border. So you have to think about what happens in every single country, every single state, every single day. So the borders have just may increase the movement of victims of trafficking, but it's not going to eliminate it, which is then re-decision itself in that particular country.
And if I may, just to help us understand it, trafficking, I think a lot of times we think moving from one country to the next, or from one state to the next, but you can move a child from Manhattan, or a woman or a male from Manhattan to Brooklyn, and they've been trafficked, right? So I don't want us to only think of borders. I want us to think of in-state, from New York to Connecticut, just that simple, so bear in mind that it doesn't just mean country to country.
Thank you. Give me a round of applause. To really actually mingle socially and get to know each one. And Ambassador, would you like to?
Debbie, thank you very, very much indeed for helping us put this together. You've done a tremendous job. We've been very lucky to hear some wonderful voices that have given us a lot of things to think about, to talk about, and it's not over. It's not over, it's over, and this is not going away. It's staying around, and we have to work at survival of those people that we're serving, that we're working with. We also have to come up with new strategies and new ideas, as we're doing at the United Nations. And I'm looking forward to the General Assembly, when hopefully we will be presenting this idea of a protocol to help identify human trafficking victims that can be applied in hospitals, healthcare centers, all over the world. Something new, something desperately needed, and something that hopefully will carry this dialogue. So again, thank you all very much.